On a quiet bend of the Chambal River, hundreds of long, narrow-snouted reptiles lie stacked along the sandbanks, jaws hanging slightly open, soaking in the last heat of the afternoon. A fisherman poles past without a second glance. To anyone drifting by today, this is simply what the river looks like. It feels permanent, as if it has always been this way. It has not. 50 years ago, a small team of scientists set out to count this exact species across every major river system in India. When they finished, the number they wrote down was 200. Not 200,000, not 200 per river, 200, in total, left alive on Earth. A species that far gone rarely gets a second chance. This one did, on one river, against odds most conservationists at the time considered hopeless. What actually happened over the next 5 decades is stranger and far more dramatic than the tidy version of this story usually gets told. The last of its kind. The animal at the center of all this is called the gharial. Say the word out loud and most people picture an ordinary crocodile. It is not one. The gharial is the sole surviving member of its own separate family of reptiles, a lineage that split off from other crocodilians millions of years ago, and then, almost everywhere else on the planet, quietly disappeared. What remains is unmistakable. A slender, absurdly long snout lined with well over 100 needle-thin teeth, built for exactly one job, spearing fish in fast-moving water. Adult males grow a strange bulbous knob at the very tip of that snout, shaped like a small clay pot. In Hindi, that pot is called a ghara. That is where the name comes from. Males can eventually stretch to nearly 6 meters. Females usually top out somewhere between 2.6 and 4.5 meters. That long, needle-toothed snout is also part of why recovery turned out to be so difficult. A gharial cannot simply relocate to whatever river happens to be available. It needs deep, fast-flowing, relatively clean water and wide sandy banks to nest on. Exactly the kind of habitat that was vanishing across the region even faster than the species itself. For most of the 20th century, this animal ruled the rivers of northern India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. Researchers estimate somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 gharials moved through the region's waterways in the 1940s alone. Then came the unraveling. Hunters killed adults for their skins. Villagers dug up nests and sold the eggs, prized locally as both food and folk remedy. Towns and farmland crept along the riverbanks, and industrial sand mining tore apart the very beaches gharials needed to reproduce. River by river, the species simply stopped showing up. By the time anyone thought to add it all up, in the mid-1970s, the global population had collapsed by more than 90%. 200 gharials, scattered across a handful of disconnected river stretches in India and Nepal. That was the entire species, an animal that a single generation earlier had been too common to bother counting. Was 200 scattered, disconnected individuals still meaningfully a species, or just an extinction that had not finished its paperwork yet? Somebody had to decide, right then, whether this was even worth saving. Project Crocodile. In 1974, an Australian herpetologist named H.R. Bustard arrived in India on behalf of the United Nations Development Programme and the Food and Agriculture Organization. His assignment was simple to describe and brutal to actually carry out. Survey what remained of India's crocodilians, and tell the government honestly whether recovery was even realistic. His findings became the blueprint for one of the most ambitious wildlife rescue efforts India has ever attempted. It helped that the legal groundwork already existed. The Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 had just given crocodilians the highest level of legal protection available under Indian law. On April 1, 1975, the government launched what is now known, somewhat informally, as Project Crocodile, and a dedicated training center for crocodile biologists opened in Hyderabad, a center that would later grow into the Wildlife Institute of India. The plan did not involve capturing wild adult gharials and releasing them elsewhere. Adult gharials are enormous, and they do not tolerate handling well. The stress alone can kill them. Instead, conservationists built what is called a Head Start program. Each year, teams walk the sandbanks of protected rivers, searching for nests, which females dig by snout into soft sand near the waterline. 30 to 40 centimeters deep, laying anywhere from 18 to 50 eggs at a time. Those eggs are carefully collected, moved to incubation centers, and kept at a steady 30 to 35 degrees Celsius for roughly 40 days. At some centers today, the hatching success rate runs above 95%. Newly hatched gharials do not need feeding right away. For their first stretch of life, they survive on yolk absorbed before they ever broke the shell. After that, keepers raise them in enclosures for around 3 years, sheltering them from the floods and predators that kill the vast majority of gharial hatchlings left in the wild, until each animal reaches roughly 1.2 meters in length. Only then are they released back into the river, large enough, in theory, to survive on their own. The centerpiece of this entire program became a single stretch of water, the Chambal River, winding along the borders of Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, and Rajasthan. By the late 1970s, roughly 435 kilometers of it had been declared a protected sanctuary, one of the last relatively untouched, free-flowing rivers left in northern India. If the gharial was going to come back anywhere on Earth, this is where it would have to happen. Among the people drawn into this work was a young, American-born herpetologist named Romulus Whitaker, who had spent much of his life in India and would eventually become known across the country simply as the Snake Man of India. In 1976, he founded the Madras Crocodile Bank Trust, a dedicated breeding and research center that would go on to work with all 3 of India's native crocodilian species. Decades later, Whitaker would receive the Whitley Award for Conservation and, in 2018, one of India's highest civilian honors, the Padma Shri. But in the late 1970s, his role in this story was far simpler, helping prove that a nearly vanished reptile could, with enough patience, actually be coaxed back from the edge. Neither he nor anyone else on the project yet knew that his name would resurface, more than 30 years later, at the center of a crisis nobody could see coming. A line bending upward. For a while, patience worked. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, hatchlings raised along the Chambal were released back into the river in growing numbers, year after year. Wild gharials began nesting again on sandbanks their grandparents had abandoned decades earlier. A species conservationists had once quietly worried might simply be unsavable, started behaving, cautiously, like one that could be saved. Huge gaps in basic knowledge still existed. Nobody had solid data on how far gharials actually traveled, where exactly they preferred to nest, or what precisely killed the ones that did not survive to adulthood. But for roughly 3 decades, the general trend pointed in one direction, up. Nobody was celebrating yet, and there was a harder truth sitting underneath the good news. While the Chambal climbed, gharial populations in most of the region's other rivers, the Ganga, the Son, the Gandak, the Mahanadi, kept shrinking, or vanishing outright. The Chambal was not just doing well. It was slowly becoming the only place left where a wild, self-sustaining population of this species still existed at all. Everything now rested on one river holding. When the river turned, then in December 2007, the river turned on them. A local conservation group working near Etawah reported the first death in the first week of that month, a gharial found dead on a sandbank for no obvious reason. Within weeks, there were more. By the end of December, 40 gharials had died. By early the following year, the toll had passed 110, almost all of them subadults between 2 and 4 meters long, and almost all of them found within a single, roughly 25-kilometer stretch of the lower Chambal. Nobody could explain it. What exactly kills more than 100 adult crocodilians in a few winter weeks, in one small stretch of river, and leaves behind no obvious cause? The Indian government convened an emergency task force. Veterinarians carried out postmortems and found something strange: gout throughout the animal's joints and internal organs, a condition tied to kidney failure, and a dangerous buildup of uric acid. Something was destroying these gharials from the inside, and quickly. Most died within 2 to 15 weeks of whatever had triggered the illness. Early theories pointed at pollution flowing down from the Yamuna River, which joins the Chambal further downstream, or possibly an invasive fish species carrying toxins from that same source. Investigators tested for heavy metals and ruled them out. They tested for a parasitic infection and ruled that out too. Meeting after meeting produced the exact same conclusion. Nobody actually knew. A couple of gangetic dolphins and a mugger crocodile turned up dead in the same stretch of river around the same time. A detail that only deepened the unease, even though investigators would later conclude those deaths were unrelated to whatever was specifically killing the gharials. For a species that had spent 30 years clawing its way back from 200 individuals, watching it lose over 100 hard-won adults to an invisible, unidentified killer felt less like a setback and more like a countdown. Every gharial that died in that stretch had taken years of head start rearing and a great deal of money simply to reach adulthood. If whatever was killing them did not stop, or could not even be identified, the entire recovery risked unraveling in a single brutal winter. 30 gharials and a question. The person who eventually helped crack the case was Whitaker, resurfacing more than 30 years after he had first helped build the Head Start program. In mid-2008, he partnered with Jeffrey Lang, a biology professor from the University of North Dakota who had spent years studying gharial behavior, and Dhruva Jyoti Basu of the World Wildlife Fund in India. Together they launched what became known as the Gharial Ecology Project, and for a long stretch of it, the team essentially lived on the riverbank, in tents and borrowed rooms in nearby villages, running the kind of unglamorous, season-after-season fieldwork that never makes it into a highlight reel, tracking the one thing nobody had properly measured before. Where, exactly, do gharials actually go? Their method was patient rather than dramatic. They radio-tagged 30 gharials and followed their movements, season after season, for years. What they found upended the leading theory. Adult female gharials, it turned out, could travel 80 to 120 kilometers in a single season, following the monsoon toward feeding grounds, and back upstream again to nest. But subadults, the exact size class hit hardest in 2007, barely moved at all. Their entire world, at that age, was a narrow stretch of river, only a few kilometers wide, a detail nobody had ever bothered to confirm before, because nobody had ever needed to. That single fact changed everything. If the gharials that died had barely traveled, then whatever killed them could not have simply drifted in from a distant, general source of Yamuna pollution. It had to be local, most likely originating within about 15 kilometers of where the bodies were actually recovered, inside the Chambal itself, rather than flowing in from elsewhere. The exact toxin was never conclusively pinned down, and nothing on that scale has recurred since, but the investigation quietly answered the question that mattered most for the species' survival. This was not proof that the whole river system was turning lethal. It was a localized, contained event, and that meant recovery, however painful, was still possible. 2026. It took years, but the population climbed back. Head Start centers along the Chambal kept collecting eggs, incubating them, and releasing juveniles, year after year, largely unnoticed by anyone outside the conservation world. Then, in 2025, the National Chambal Sanctuary recorded 2,026 gharials during its annual count, the highest number since systematic monitoring of the river began, decades earlier. Sit with that for a second. 50 years after a national survey found 200 gharials left on the entire planet, one three-state stretch of a single Indian river now holds over 2,000 of them. Madhya Pradesh alone is now home to more than 80% of India's entire wild gharial population. Nowhere else on Earth comes close. For a species biologists once quietly discussed in terms of if rather than when, that is not a small statistic. It is close to a textbook definition of a species pulled back from the edge of extinction, on the strength of one very deliberate, very patient, 5-decade project on one river. No dramatic rescue montage produced that number. Decades of unremarkable repetitive fieldwork did. The same egg collection, the same incubation routine, the same yearly release, done correctly, on the same river, for 50 years in a row. The recovery has even started paying the river back in smaller ways. Stretches of the Chambal Sanctuary now draw boat safaris and wildlife tourists hoping to see wild gharials basking in the open, something that was simply not possible a generation ago. A comeback story, it turns out, can also become a livelihood. But numbers like that can create a dangerously tidy ending, And this story does not actually have one yet. So what is actually missing from the neat version of this recovery? The people who share the sandbanks. None of this happened in an empty landscape. The Chambal is not a sealed-off wilderness. It runs past farms, fishing villages, and sandbanks that local communities have used for generations. Alongside other rare species the river still supports, Gangetic river dolphins among them. Fishermen working these waters do not always welcome an animal competing with them for the same fish, and in some stretches, gharials still drown after becoming tangled in the same gill nets those families depend on for income. Farmers plant seasonal crops directly on sandbanks gharials need for nesting. Illegal sand mining, driven by nearby construction demand, physically strips away the very riverbed material the species requires to dig nests in the first place. Conservationists on the Chambal have had to spend nearly as much energy negotiating with people as they have spent managing crocodilians. That has meant working with fishing communities to locate and remove abandoned ghost nets before they trap wildlife, involving villagers directly in monitoring and reporting nests, and treating local river knowledge as seriously as any GPS dataset. One conservationist working on the sanctuary put it plainly in a recent interview. The real achievement here is not only a healthier gharial population, it is a healthier river, one that still supports fish, still supports dolphins, and still, mostly, functions the way a river is supposed to. Saving a nearly extinct reptile, it turned out, required saving the relationship between an entire river and the people who live alongside it. Older than the project. There is one more layer to this story that most conservation reports leave out entirely. Long before anyone counted gharials, or built a rearing center, this animal had already secured a place in Indian mythology. Ganga, the river goddess, for whom the Ganges is named, is traditionally depicted riding a creature called the Makara, a hybrid being, part aquatic, part terrestrial, carved into temple walls and doorways across the subcontinent for centuries. Descriptions of the Makara vary between traditions, but several accounts specifically identify it with the Gharial, pointing to that same unmistakable long, narrow snout. Beyond Ganga's own iconography, Makara carvings traditionally stand guard at temple entrances in both Hindu and Buddhist architecture, treated as protectors of thresholds and gateways rather than simple decoration. In other words, the animal India spent 50 years trying not to lose had already been riding alongside one of the country's oldest river goddesses and standing guard at temple doors, long before it ever needed anyone's help. Not finished yet. And the story is still being written. In January 2026, the Rajasthan government approved the denotification of roughly 732 hectares from the National Chambal Gharial Sanctuary. Officials described it as a boundary correction, resolving old overlaps between the sanctuary, revenue land, and inhabited villages, rather than any weakening of protection for the river as a whole. Is a boundary correction ever really just a boundary correction, though, on a river where every hectare has already been fought over once? Conservationists were considerably less convinced, arguing that the Chambal's recovery had never rested on any single parcel of land, but on the cumulative, uninterrupted protection of the whole stretch, decade after decade. Once a stretch of protected river loses its legal status, it becomes much easier to justify the next construction project, the next sand mining lease, the next small erosion of habitat that, taken on its own, looks harmless. At the same time, conservationists have been trying to prove the Chambal model can actually travel. In February 2024, the West Bengal Forest Directorate released 37 captive-bred young gharials into the Ganga River in the state's Murshidabad district, an attempt to re-establish the species somewhere entirely new. Within the first 15 days, 3 of those gharials were killed, tangled in abandoned fishing nets nobody had cleared from the water. The rest survived, and once those nets were finally removed, no further deaths were recorded. But the episode was a blunt reminder that the exact same threat that nearly finished this species off in the 20th century has not gone away. It has simply moved to wherever conservationists try to expand next. So here is the honest, unresolved version of this story. On one river over 50 years, a species with 200 individuals became a species with over 2,000. That is real, and it is genuinely extraordinary. But globally, across every river this animal has ever called home, well under 1,000 adults remain in the wild, and the gharial has already vanished entirely from Pakistan, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. Whether the Chambal's recovery becomes the model that eventually saves this species everywhere, or one remarkable success story surrounded by continued decline elsewhere, is a question nobody currently gets to answer with any certainty. Still swimming. Picture that same bend of the Chambal again. Hundreds of long-snouted reptiles, stacked along the sandbanks in the afternoon sun. It looks permanent. It looks like it has always been this way. It very nearly was not. 50 years ago, this river could easily have gone silent, the way so many others already had. Pakistan's rivers went silent. Bangladesh's rivers went silent. Myanmar's rivers went silent. The Chambal did not, because a small group of scientists, forest officials, and local communities decided that a species down to 200 individuals was still worth the decades of unglamorous, patient work it would take to bring back, egg by egg, nest by nest, year after year, through a mystery illness nobody could initially explain, and a policy fight that remains unresolved today. The gharial is the last living branch of its entire family tree, the only one of its kind left anywhere on Earth, older than the rivers most of us assume have always looked exactly the way they look today. For a while, it genuinely looked like that branch might simply end, not in one dramatic final moment, but quietly, the way most extinctions actually happen, one unnoticed year at a time. Instead, on this one river, it is still here, still nesting on the same sandbanks its ancestors used. Still, according to some of the oldest stories told along these banks, riding quietly alongside a goddess. Whether that is enough to call this species safe, or only safe for now, is genuinely up for debate. So here is the actual question worth sitting with. Does a comeback like this count as a happy ending, or just a very long pause before the next crisis? Leave your answer in the comments below. And if you want to see where this story goes next, on the Chambal, and on every river conservationists are now trying to reach after it, subscribe, because this river is not finished yet.